Before we really begin, a quick thing I wanted to put at the beginning of the video rather than the end. This will be the last blog for a little bit, but there is an extremely vague chance that the campaign will be continuing in a slightly different format. I don't want to make any promises, especially since I'm not 100% sure of the details yet, and I don't want to get anyone's hopes up. But I just wanted to let you guys know there was a sufficient outcry, which was really surprising, because this is actually, analytics-wise, metrics-wise, this is my least watched feature on my show. But nevertheless, because there was enough people who had their desire for this campaign to continue, I am exploring options, and that's all I'm going to say, because that's all I got for you right now. Now, after the last episode, the party decided one of the things they needed to do, pretty much pronto, was try to look into the situation, because that reminds me of something I really want to stress. I ended the last episode with what I call a meanwhile elsewhere. In other words, if this was a book, it would be a cut to another scene, right? But the reader's aware of that, aka you guys are aware of that. The characters are not aware of that. That is an important distinction, which is very important to be kept in mind. The other thing to be kept in mind is that, to the player's awareness, nobody's actually fully aware of what happened over that town, or nobody's fully aware of the disaster that just befell. So all they know is that some kind of super bomb just went off in Illuvian territory after an Avere ship attacked. Yeah, I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. But the party had no idea the scope or scale of what happened, or the idea of what happened. Now, Rory very much wanted to go straight to the center, the epicenter, to deal with whatever was there. Props to him for some good role-playing on this, because Rory, the character, again, had no idea what was going on, and basically wasn't really thinking in that moment. He was just reacting. He just wanted to go there and deal with this. No surprise. The other party members eventually managed to talk him out of it, as they stressed that it was more important to try and figure out what was happening with the other towns that were nearby, because there could have been damage, or they don't know how badly they were hit. I mean, the only reason the facility survived was because it was a psionic facility, or at least that's what they're assuming. There are reasons why it survived, which obviously I have not shared yet in character, but you get the idea. So eventually they talked them into going ahead and moving on. So they headed out towards one of the nearby towns. Now, they actually headed towards, Irondell? Yes, Irondell. Excuse me, I had to double click on that one. Wow, I am a geek. I've got my notes up here so I can actually read my own summarizations. They headed towards Irondell to figure out what happened, but they had to rest on the way there. Now, as a writer, I've always believed in two concepts. One is what I like to call the twofold punch. The other is what I like to call the breath. Basically, if I ever drop a hammer in a story I'm doing, especially an interactive one like a campaign, there's probably going to be another hammer immediately following it, somewhere along the lines, and most of my players kind of get used to this. However, one thing I tend to be really good at is manipulating the player's expectations of where and what this hammer is, as it often comes in ways they don't expect. That's all I'm going to say about that. But the reason I mentioned the breath is because it was really important to me to cover over two things that I'd been building up towards for a while now in character, that I had been actually planning for. One regarding Rory, and one regarding Javin. Now, I'm going to keep you up to date on this just in case you haven't been tracking the characters. Rory, the human barbarian from Visay and Lascelles, is someone who basically activated one of the Tusker mines, as the party counted them, back in the Anetheron facility. And while they were there, they actually successfully disabled and dismantled all of those. Yay! They never got around to curing Thog of that. Well, each time Rory reverted to his Tusker form, it was referred to as Thog. Now, I tried to describe what Thog was with regards to Rory in great detail. The general idea is that what actually happens in character is that Rory's soul, self, whatever you want to call it, is literally transmuted into a new being, as if this was what Rory had always been, except this new Rory was a Tusker. The thing is, behind the scenes, I had been doing a couple of rolls and keeping track of how many nights had passed since that initial incident. And when it reached a certain number, it got to the point where Thog had basically stopped being a mindless beast, and had actually gained what I would call sentience. Not merely intelligence, but actual sentience, self-awareness. Now, that actually happened a few days ago in game time. It just never came up until now because of the fact that every night, and the party had this as an understanding, Firnasil, as soon as he would revert to Thog, Firnasil would mind tap him and put him down, right? Now, if you're paying attention, Firnasil is on the ship, which is off with the Olthoi. Similarly, Javin, way back on the Aphis Lacelle, had his soul augmented, Guido did too, actually, by the psionic devices that were there. Now, I had decided way back then what the results of that would be, and I kept it quiet, but the entire time up until now, I had been kind of tossing things at Javin in a very specific way. In fact, if you'll forgive me for pulling up my notes here on this, give me just a moment. This should not actually, I should have had this up already. Behind the screen is what I called this little section. So I had been... Okay, I'm just going to quote myself here. From that point on, I had made it a point to try and feed Javin what I called moments of awesome. And if you've been paying attention in a lot of the previous combat sections and a lot of the things, Javin has been having moments of awesome, where he just takes out guys from forever away, or he leaps up onto things, or he meets these dragoons, and he goes to the air temple, all this awful stuff. Or awesome, stuff. The reason why was it distracted Javin the player from what was happening to Javin the character, and in character it distanced Javin from the event of his soul alteration, because Javin's existence was unstable, and so his focus determined his reality, and as long as he was being distracted by these moments, he would remain Javin. The moment he stopped doing that, he would begin to change. And... well, let's just say that the incident that just happened at Marblebush is probably a good way to bring a halt to that and force this change onto Javin. So, while the party is traveling to Irondell, two things happen. One, Rory goes to sleep and Thog wakes up fully sentient, fully cognizant, with access to some, but not all, of Rory's memories, and can fully speak common without issue. Snarg and Higaide had promised to stay behind to take care of this and watch over them. However, they had absolutely no idea how to do with this because they weren't expecting this at all. In fact, nobody was. I was actually really proud of this session. Rory did a great job of role-playing Thog. I just gave him some general, guidelines. You're sentient, you're thinking, how you want to behave, how you want your personality to be formed is totally up to you. You have access to some of your memories and knowledge, but not all of them. Here's what Firnasil has been dealing with you, blah, 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 blah. And so Rory, the player, role-played Thog, the character, extremely well. And Snarg and Higaide were both like, and there was like this hour session of the three of them role-playing as Snarg and Higaide tried desperately to contain this Tusker who didn't understand why it needed to be contained. Why he, needed to be contained. It was actually really awesome. Eventually it reached the point where they decided, because, they were like, why don't you just go to sleep? They kept trying to convince Thog to go to sleep, but Thog wasn't tired. Why would he be? He just woke up from his perspective. So he's like, no, I'm not tired, what are you talking about? Let's go. And so Snarg's like, okay, let's go hunting. Okay, let's go hunting. And let's teach you what cooking is. And so they taught Thog how to cook, and Thog was like, oh, okay, this is cooked food. This is much better than what I was expecting, It was pretty awesome. After a while, they did convince him to go to sleep, which reverted him back to Rory, who was, of course, at this point still asleep and would be for the next several hours. On the path, I'm just going to kind of discuss this in general, because the actual specific order of events was kind of weird. It's more like they left, they camped, then they went here, and then they did stuff in town very briefly, and then they went, and then there was other stuff. I'm just going to tell this in the order it makes most sense to tell from a story perspective. Javin was getting worse and worse. He was getting kind of ranty. He began talking about how the air and the sky and the trees were asking him to jump, and he kept jumping on trees. Keep in mind, Javin is in fact a Dragoon at this point. He has taken the class, so he has the jump class ability. So he's literally jumping into trees, and some of the other party members are trying to restrain him because they just think he's being stupid or whatever. And it takes a bit for them to realize that Javin is actually kind of losing his mind. And he's just like, "Wee, you don't understand. You should join me. You should join me, yes." And yeah. And as he was doing this, Javin is a fairy, to remind you, and his skin started to have little, tiny, tiny little bits of crystal start to grow out of him. Just tiny little formations all over the place, all over his skin. Very sky light blue crystals. And he was, wait, yes, light blue. I was just checking my notes there. I was like, ah. And as the night went on and as they continued traveling, that kind of got worse. I'm going to go ahead and pause here because the next thing they did was they hit Irondell, which was fine. No issues, no problems. They were actually far enough away that all they heard was the loud noise from whatever happened back at Marblebush. But when they got to Irondell, they basically got no useful information at all. It's actually the note I have right here. They got lots of hearsay. I went out of my way to make up a bunch of completely random wild rumors about aliens attacking, and the Neveri have conquered half of Alluvia, and communications have cut off, and all the leaders are dead, just all sorts of stuff. Because all they knew was that there was this horrible loud sound, and that, they were at war, and that's basically all they knew. So they didn't actually find out much. But this did give them a very important piece of information. And that is the fact that the explosion was a contained area, which was something the characters, and props to them for role-playing this properly, they didn't know what the extent of this devastation was. Now, granted, it's not my style to make an entire fluid, morphic, incredibly dynamic, incredibly complicated world and then destroy it. It's just not my style as a writer. I mean, I could do that later, maybe, but not this early on. So, realistically speaking, of course the world is still there, but the general concern was that it might not be, that this explosion just kind of kept expanding until it took out everything. Wouldn't that have made an interesting campaign setting? A new Dyers, maybe? So they get to Irondell, they talk with the people there. Remember, Irondell is basically exchange territory at this point, so they have a few contacts, they restock, they take a night's rest. They head out towards Johnwall, which is still a giant debris pile. One of the things that I found funny is as they were heading out to Johnwall, Zeiss was trying to get a message to Snarg or vice versa. I actually don't remember the specific order of events. It just wasn't working out well. Or maybe it was Javin was trying to wake up Zeiss, and so he had to actually jump into him, and they ended up jumping through the window. Anyways, point being, Snarg ended up leaving early because he was just mentally destroyed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Remember that two-punch thing I mentioned earlier? That I actually kind of already did the second punch. The first punch was the destruction, was the annihilation of Marblebush. In fact, on my world map, which I've been maintaining for some time now and slowly adding more and more detail to it, there's now a giant gray, perfectly mathematically circular circle of gray where there didn't used to be, to give you an idea. So that was the first hammer. The second hammer was the suicide that happened at the end of that. And I kind of had to insist that happened as a GM for various reasons, not only because it made a lot of sense, but it really hammered it home, because it's one thing to say, oh my god, thousands of people are dead. It's another to see someone who you personally have interacted with, you personally have saved their life, then die as a result of what just happened. So Snarg was really, really out of it. He left. He had to do something. So the party wakes up sometime later, goes after him. They arrive at Johnwall. During this trip, Javin was getting much, much worse. It got to the point where he had to literally be restrained, and I was doing some kind of dice rolls on the background here, and it reached the point finally where he basically passed out. And those crystals I mentioned kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it got to the point where, you're actually getting juts of crystal coming out of his skin, to the point where you almost can't see his skin under the crystal, and eventually it grows to the point where he's in this giant carapace. Now, when he came out of the carapace, he now had these crystals all over the place, much more patterned. I can actually picture it visually. Forgive me for not explaining it or describing it with the skill that my mind can make pictures. But basically, stylized crystals coming out in directions all across his jawline, going this, some going back like this, some coming back through here. All of them are all angular. None of them are particularly long. I'd say a fingernail length at absolute most. They all... His skin itself was now glittering, very similar to a scion's, make of that what you will. And his scarf had actually fused with his body and was now actually a part of him. So he now had this growth wrapping around and then flailing behind him. And the scarf itself also had the crystals within it, just like the rest of his skin did. Now, he felt much more energetic and much more enthusiastic and much more manic after this translation. However, he had no idea what had happened or why. Didn't have the slightest clue. But he decided, yeah, this will be great. I kind of feel bad for Javin the player, because Javin the player understood just how screwed his character was. But anyways. After all these events, they left Janwall and decided, okay, we're going to head to Holberg. Now, if you're remembering, Guido and Z are actually already at Holberg, having headed there straight from Marblebush. They never actually saw the devastation of Marblebush. They just left. When they got here, a few things happened. I'm just going to go ahead and read over my notes here. Give me just a moment. Within Holberg, they took some time to relax and reconnoiter. They did a fair amount of shopping. It's always fun to do. I meant out of character. It's always fun to like look up the list and it's like, okay, here's your gold, here's what you got, let's do some random rolls, you know. Before the party actually hired a small sailing vessel. Snarg had actually hired it. I actually really liked this. Snarg hired it because they had carried the corpse of their goblin friend, the woman who committed suicide, Sally. They brought her with them, so they could burn her and spread her ashes onto the waves in a simulacra of goblin rites. That's not actually how goblin burial rites work exactly. I described it to them. But it was basically the best they could do under the circumstances, and so they wanted to do that to honor her, which I thought was pretty awesome. I also mentioned the fact that while they were out, they saw a ship leaving which looked exactly like the ship that they had. Now, if you're thinking, what ship? Then you've probably forgotten some time ago when the ship conquered, when the party conquered Janwall. I shouldn't say conquered, when they liberated Janwall. There was a ship left over from whoever the attackers were, who called themselves member of the Boeotians, which we still have no definition for. The ship was basically completely unmanned, didn't have much on board, but it was a ship. It was a decent-sized vessel, frigate-sized, regular ship, not airship. In fact, it was a sailing vessel, to be more clear, not a magicide ship. And they had basically laid claim to it. Coulson had hired a captain, sent her out, and basically said, crew it up and get it ready for us. And that was the last they heard from it, and they never really bothered to follow up on it until they went to Janwall, at which point they got busy, and then Janwall was destroyed. So they see this ship leaving, and they're like, huh? And they decide, well, you know what? Whatever. We're not going to pursue that. We've got more important things to deal with. Because, and I mentioned this several episodes ago, the party wants to go confront Bonebreaker. Now, I mentioned this in my video about how I didn't understand, out of character, me, the GM, didn't understand how so many of the party members felt so betrayed and so agitated towards Bonebreaker for his actions, because they made perfect sense to me. Some of them have since explained that the point was that while his actions made perfect sense, he should have run them by the party, and that's what they were upset about. So, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Regardless, they were going to be like, okay, look, Bonebreaker, we need to talk. And so the first thing they did was they visited Aoran. Now, Zeiss personally interrogated Aoran because Zeiss had the highest deception roll of the party members who were present, Z not being one of them. Aoran was surprised by the news of Bonebreaker's betrayal, and he had nothing to add or discuss with them. I mention that because it was a lengthy conversation, there were a lot of dice rolls, but the bottom line was the party did not detect him being in any kind of a lie, and as near as the party could tell, Aoran was basically just completely ignorant of whatever was going on. I'm not going to say innocent, because that's a different terminology. But he was definitely ignorant, no idea what was going on. So they were like, okay, fine. So then they went after, Bonebreaker. Now Zeiss decided he was going to start portraying a unified leader. He was going to start behaving as the warlord of the Exchange bloc. In case I haven't emphasized it yet, a lot of the remnants of the Exchange have divided into what I've been calling blocks, B-L-O-C, for anybody who's curious. Each of these blocks is headed up by someone who has basically been termed a warlord. There's a specific block in the Nevere area around Iraq, specifically, who kind of started this trend. And he called himself the warlord of the Nevere Raiders, and as a result, it just kind of caught on, and so a lot of different sects had popped up, all calling themselves blocks and calling themselves warlords. The group decided they needed to kind of unify, and Zeiss basically took the position, especially since Zeiss and Coulson have basically been the two people who have most been taking care of the exchange business in general. So Zeiss also did a few things off-camera. Well, I shouldn't say off-camera, but not during the live sessions. Most of these had to do with insisting that his personal family emblem become the symbol for the exchange, insisting that the troops recognize him on sight and recognize him as the warlord, insisting that his orders should be followed before everyone else's, that kind of thing. Just kind of trying to solidify his personal control over things. When they confronted Bonebreaker himself, they found a surprise on their way there. First, Bonebreaker was with several adventurers, which was kind of eyebrow-raising. The other surprise was Sereth. Now, I'm not going to be surprised if you ask Sereth who. Sereth was, complicated, but basically, in character, Sereth is an elf who is who is a very good friend of Zeiss in character. Basically his only friend, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean like he's the only one Zeiss actually trusts. Sereth related to the group exactly what had happened to him. I was playing Sereth for this, which was actually kind of a challenge, trying to play a character I hadn't invented. He had basically been abandoned in Janwal, and when Janwal had been taken over by the runners, he found himself forced into conscription. However, because he's really good, talking, he decided to go ahead and talk his way into a position on the ship that I mentioned earlier. There he met a familiar face, the elven captain who'd been sent there, and between the two of them, they decided to go ahead and escape the area. The woman decided, under standard maritime laws, based on the time passed and the total lack of interest from the exchange, that she was going to go ahead and claim the ship as her own. In so doing, she decided to sail off. Sereth assisted her in escaping from Janwal. Timeline-wise, this basically happened right before the Janwal combat, where Janwal was extinguished, and headed down towards Holberg. And of course, then Sereth got off in Holberg, and she restocked and set up the ship, and then she left for show territories. Now, Bonebreaker. So that's what happened with Sereth. When they talked to Bonebreaker, they're like, "Can we talk to you alone?" And he went ahead and shooed away all his other individuals, all the other people who were there. And then they were like, "Okay, we need to know what the hell is going on with you." Now, Bonebreaker was completely unapologetic in his actions. He, in his opinion, and this wasn't just the GM speaking, this was Bonebreaker in character, felt like he had done nothing wrong. This was just business as usual. This is how the undermarket had worked, too. So he was just doing what he always does. So he was completely unapologetic for keeping the party out of the loop, and it was his argument that, they were having a mutually beneficial relationship here, that they were off doing their adventuring things, as he put it, and he was running his business behind the scenes, successfully, he added. Now, that being said, Zeiss pretty much insisted flat out, "You have to keep us in the loop on everything." Actually, I believe he said, "You have to keep me in the loop on everything." But regardless, you have to keep us in the loop on everything. And Zeiss actually appointed Sereth as the group's liaison, so Sereth would have daily meetings with Bonebreaker to be kept apprised of what's going on. That settled, the group decided to go ahead and figure out their next step of exactly what they were going to do. And so they were going to go ahead and travel to the Light Temple. Now, they'd wanted to go to the Light Temple for several reasons, not the least of which being the fact that, well, they were kind of, ignoring the fact that it's the nearest temple and a lot of people really wanted to go there, there was still some concern about Higaide, who's still kind of, and Javin, who's, and Rory, who's Thog. So they went ahead and decided to go. So the nearest hub travel to the Light Temple is Arwick. So they went ahead and took the hub to Arwick. Now, a couple things happened in very quick order. Now, Z was with the party as of this point. Z decided to go ahead and join up with them towards the Light Temple. While they were, immediately after leaving the hub transit, and immediately after entering Arwick proper, all the fairies were acting extremely unusual and oddly towards Javin, and were looking at him really, really weird. And that's basically how I described it. I went into a little more detail, but Z figured out what was going on very quickly. Props to some quick thinking there. And Z quickly told Javin, you need to act like Zeiss's aspect, like right now. And so Javin just kind of meandered over to Zeiss, and Zeiss was like, come, Javin. And all the fairies just kind of shrugged it off, like, oh, okay, gotcha. In case you're missing it, Javin, fairies don't really see like we do. I mean, they do have sight, but they can also literally, physically see elements, right? This, obviously, this means they can see desolates instantly and without hesitation. It also means they can see kind of elemental flow, elemental creatures, and of course, elemental entities that are, like aspects, summoned creatures. So they looked at Javin, who looked for all intents and purposes like a fairy, except for the fact that he also looked like an aspect. So they were just like, huh? And they didn't know what to make of that. So the fact that he started acting like an aspect just made them just kind of brush it off as, okay, it's an unusual looking aspect, sure. Now, Javin wasn't actually 100% sure what to do about that. There was one interesting event. Javin insisted on revisiting the pools. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the pools are where fairies are birthed from. I'm going to describe this very briefly for those of you who don't remember. A fairy is birthed fully adult, fully formed, and with sentience and cognizance and the ability to talk and think about math and all that stuff, just like that, right? They come out of the pool and they know. Now they still have zero experience and zero memories, but you get the general concept, right? And there are these individuals known as the keepers, all fairies as well, who keep the pool, who take care of the people who come out, maintain the pool itself, make sure the elemental flow is going, blah, 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 blah. Now, it is known that the pool is directly connected to the ley lines, otherwise not much is known about exactly how or why this process happens. While Javin was there, he began to hear voices in his ear. Obviously, he had to go there with Zeiss, because he's still pretending to be Zeiss's aspect. But after, as he heard the voices, he just kind of lost himself for a moment, and he rushed over to the keepers and was like, can't you hear that? Don't you understand what that is? And the keepers, realizing he wasn't actually an aspect, started acting really weirdly about him and demanding to know what the hell was wrong with him. And one of the things, and I wrote it down here so I could quote myself, they berated him for attempting to go back home. However, Javin had no idea what they were talking about, and he's just like, I'd go back home. No, I just wanted to visit and hope you guys knew something about my condition. To which the keepers were like, oh, okay. And obviously they didn't know anything about his condition. They had nothing to share, so they couldn't actually help him with that. Meanwhile, Snarg had rented an auditorium. You may be like, why? It was so they could have a place for Thog to sleep for the night. Because, they were keeping him in the city. That was their decision. Rather than taking him out, they were just going to rent an auditorium and live with that. So Thog shows up. He has access to basically all of Rory's memories at this point, although he's not fully cognizant of it yet. And Tuskers also receive a huge amount of their sensory input from scent, which probably makes a lot of sense. So Thog was there with Snarg, and Javin was there with him, in addition to Higaide. And Thog could not smell Javin at all. He had zero scent. And in fact, he couldn't smell virtually anything. He didn't even smell like he was in a city. Normally there's scents of people all over the place, but instead it was just blank. And so he's like, well, there's no problem with going anywhere. This kind of went badly, as Thog didn't understand why they were trying to restrain him so desperately, until it reaches the point where Thog actually kind of broke down a wall in a half-hearted attempt to escape. The party managed to talk him down very quickly, and then very quickly figured out a situation where they were going to go ahead and talk their way through the ferries, and of course pay out the nose for the auditorium wall that they had just destroyed. However, there was a couple of character developments towards the end there, which I'm kind of which happened in a weird order. But basically, Thog had access to Rory's memories, as I mentioned, but he wasn't really cognizant of it. But now he actually was cognizant of it. He actually started thinking about it, and he started realizing that those memories were not his. They were Rory's, not Thog's, to differentiate the two. Because in case I haven't made this clear enough, these are two, for all intents and purposes, these are two completely separate sentient entities. They're just made from the same material. So Thog didn't take that too well, and really, really flipped out. And it took a lot of calming down, a lot of talking, a lot of discussions. Like, okay, look, we'll deal with this. We don't know what to do about this. Just give us time. An idea was put forth that Thog and Rory could keep a diary of sorts to communicate with each other. And then Thog finally went to sleep, which leaves us to the next day. Click. Which is up here somewhere. Here we go. Now, a substantial fee for the chunk of wall Thog had destroyed. They did manage to talk their way out of revealing anything to the authorities. Now, once again, I wish I could describe verbally what I see in my head. The Light Temple. It was about 3 in the morning when they arrived in visual range of the Light Temple. So it was very dark out, so they got a pretty good view of this place. The Light Temple was constructed of a huge, deep, glowing amber light, which was solid. It was hard light, to use the science fiction term. It had pulses of white and yellow streaking along it, in corners and lines throughout it. The central structure was a large ring, kind of like this. Like, okay, if this is the ground, and then there's this small little pedestal thing, and there's this ring like this, and then coming up from on this are these two arm-looking things that go up like this, and both the arms and the ring are that solid, hard lights, amber thing that I mentioned. The whole place is just glowing, and the pattern and style of the yellow and white lights almost look like starlight, except obviously it's starlight against the amber as opposed to starlight against the black of actual space, if that makes any sense. There is a huge township at the base of it. It's actually kind of different, and this is true every other temple that the party has been to. There's always been a town at the base of the temple for obvious reasons. But in this case, this town was a little different for two big reasons. One, it was much larger than normal. Most of the other towns were just basically temple-run outposts, shops, markets, places of communion and rest, and of course the actual housing for the temple, the order agents who work at the temple itself, right? And that's it. This is a full-on city at the base of the Light Temple. Furthermore, there's one other thing here. This is the Light Temple. Now, I believe I described the 8 elements earlier, but as a result, the air around here is so lively and so energetic that this is literally a city that never sleeps. I'll describe more about that in a minute. But even Rory, who at this point is fully aware of Thog... Oh, and by the way, at this point, Rory now has access to Thog's memories, too. So, at this point, Thog has basically become as much of an individual being as he's going to get. And the two of them are as connected as they are going to get, barring other influences. So Rory has a lot on his mind, but even Rory was like, yeah, this is awesome. All of their fatigue was gone. All of their, the weight, the emotional weight, the literal physical weight, it was gone. It was replaced with boisterous energy. Even from a distance, they could hear what sounded like a citywide party, because that's exactly what it was. Now, before I keep going, I want to describe one other thing that's kind of important. Ever since the disaster at Janwell, the party has been running with 0 mana. I think I mentioned this before, but in case I didn't, that was several days ago in game time. It was Janwell, Irondell, up to Marblebush, back down to Irondell, back down to Janwell, Holberg, Arick, here. No mana. 0 mana the entire time. None of them regenerated mana in that period of time. After the day after this one, when dawn rises the next time, after visiting the Light Temples the first time, they've had access to mana since then. That's all the information the characters have access to, and that's all I'm sharing on the matter. But I wanted to mention it because it had been kind of a subplot that the party had been dealing with. Several party members had actually been doing experiments and tests trying to figure out what the heck was going on with that. But anyways. So, citywide party. Like I said, it literally was, this entire city is basically a never-ending festival that had actually been going on for decades. And I mean that literally. It has literally not stopped for decades. Not only because of the nature of the light element, people here don't need to rest, they don't get tired, they don't need to sleep, so they just kind of keep going for as long as they feel like it. Now, eventually, obviously, people leave, and more people come in, so it's not like the same, however many people have been partying for 20 years, or however many years. But the point is, the city as a whole has never stopped this festival, basically since the city has grown up out of it. And it's not like there was any point in time at which everyone just said, let's party! It's just kind of grew as people came more and more to the Light Temple as the area built up more and more around it. Rather than, I like this part. I think some of my party members thought I was joking, but rather than most normal forms of public transportation, there is a massive conga line that circles and moves through the city, which people would join. You just kind of hop in, and then you would debark once you reach your destination. A couple of the party members really liked that. The place, I'm just going to read my quote here, because this kind of describes it in a nutshell. The place was alive with food, entertainment, and joyous activity. They spent quite a while here doing some R&R, buying a few goods, relaxing for the first time in a while in character. It took most of the party members a while to decide to go ahead and head to the Light Temple itself. And once they got in here, there were these platforms, I hesitate to call them elevators, but that's basically what they were, except they weren't a box, it was just a platform. If you've played WildStar, you actually know what I'm talking about. I know, recent reference there. But they were constructed of the same hard light material that everything else was, the same amber, the same lights going through it. And it moved kind of slowly, but it would take people up to the higher levels. And as they're going through there, they discovered a couple things. I mentioned that ring, right? Now, obviously, this temple's huge, so this obviously is nowhere near getting across the size of this thing. But as you're walking up here, do I have anything I could... I don't really have anything I could emulate a person with. Yeah, whatever. As a person's coming up here, and they start walking, on the surface of the bottom of the ring here, if they were to keep walking, the outer edge of the ring would continue to be the ground for them until they reach the point where they're up here, and the ground is that way, and you get where I'm going with this. No matter where they were at in the ring, outwards to the ring still kept them that way. Gravity still pushed them that way. It was the same thing for the arms going up here. Once you actually started walking up the arms, you started walking up on the, on the wall, basically, until you reached the top, at which point you could start walking on the actual top here. The two arms actually reached right at the middle. At the very peak of this, at the very middle point where the arms reached, is exactly where the focus was, where the loci was, as I call them. I'll get to that in a moment. So there were, the party enjoyed the novelty of walking on the walls for a bit. A couple of them had to do a couple of will saves because of how disorienting it was. One of the party members mentioned how amusing it was that every single temple has something that's just a little bit unnerving just to be there. It took them a while to get to the top. Not too long. It's basically about a mile in the air, give or take. Maybe not quite a mile, more like 4,000 feet. But regardless, it took them a while to walk up there, especially given how crowded this place is. And then they walked out to the part where the wings connect, went to where the loci was, and where the trial was. Now, interestingly enough, every single member of the party decided to undergo the trial this time, which I found fascinating, because that's actually, I believe, the first time everyone in the party has undergone the trial. I could be wrong. Maybe they all did it at the air trial. Regardless, they all went in. Not going to share that, of course. I never do. However, there was one thing that was universal for all their trials. While they were going through the trial, there was this sense, this emotive, overwhelming dread that just kind of lended flavor to everything else that was happening. Sometimes they would accomplish things, sometimes they would engage in things, sometimes they were afraid, sometimes they were exuberant, but no matter what happened, they could never shake that feeling of dread. And in fact, it was so omnipresent that they didn't even notice it until they left the trial. Whether they succeeded or failed, when they left and went back into, you know, the real world, they realized the contrast between how they feel and how they felt, and the dread just kind of faded away instantly. They didn't know what to make of that. Scroll down. Now, as they were there, they were enjoying what I am going to describe as a suspiciously enjoyable buffet table, which was set out for people who left the trial. When I say suspiciously enjoyable, let me make this clear. People had to make will saves, 2 of them. One to avoid... Okay, there was mango juice and there was food. I described the food. I'm not going to describe it here. But if you ate the food or drank the juice, you had to do a will save for each to stop. To stop eating and to stop drinking. Now, the funny part is, a lot of the party members found a way around this. Some events happen in a moment. I'll describe those in a second. But, for example, Guido and Snarg, I believe both, just scooped up armfuls of the food and kept eating as they ran off, because they failed their will save. So they couldn't stop eating and they couldn't stop drinking. But they wanted to do things, so they found a way around that. Several of the fairies, Javin himself included, spotted some kind of absence of elemental energy in the air near them, which was wrong. Mere minutes later, as they were trying to figure out what was going on with this, the Skyclaw became visible in the distance. Now, the party was like, "Oh God, what do we do? The Skyclaw's coming to attack," because of the non-elemental energy thing that just happened. But when the ship itself approached, it came close to the temple, and basically let out a message that everyone within the temple, within the city around the temple, and in the temple itself could hear. The message was the fact that the party quickly identified that Fear Nasil was on the ship, just to make that clear really quick. The Olthoi claimed that the ship was of Olthoi design, not psionic design, and they were this was their ship, and they were going to use it peacefully to provide support in the form of food, aid, medicine, supplies, etc., impartially across the continent in these harsh times, and they called their ship the Sperka, which roughly translated is named Hope. This done, they learned, and the party was like, "Oh my God, really?" And some of them weren't actually 100% sure what to do with regards to this ship. A lot of the party members thought it was unfair that the Skyclaw had basically been taken from underneath them and that they weren't going to be able to use it anymore. Some of the party members felt like the Olthoi were the perfect choice for dealing with a superweapon ship like this. There was a deal of contention, but ultimately what they learned, Fear Nasil and Rikarg both left the ship and rejoined the party. They found out something interesting. The Skyclaw, or rather the Sperka, had actually circled the globe in the last few days. Its journey had taken it directly over the lost continent of Arborian. Now, I don't know how much you guys have been paying attention to the lore or mythos or whatever of this setting, but nobody's ever come back from Arborian, ever, in recorded history. So this would be the first time, literally. When they went over there, the continent itself was incredibly heavily urbanized. There was very, very little terrain that was not covered by cityscape. It was almost an ecumenopolis, I believe is how you pronounce that. Not quite, obviously, because that's planet-wide, but it was the same general concept, right? However, it was totally abandoned. And when I say totally, I mean completely. With the advanced scanners, which Kazrinthka was manning on the Sperka, they discovered that there were no animals, there were no bugs, there were no people, there were no bacteria, no plants, nothing. There was 0 living material on the entire continent. I'm just going to let that sink in for a moment. That done, the group decided to try and figure out what they were going to happen next. While they were doing that, I pulled Zeiss aside and gave him a letter, basically. I believe I actually read it out loud. But the idea was Zeiss got a letter from Sereth. It basically said that Sereth and Bonebreaker had come up with a plan. They had concocted an idea to further the exchange's position, money, etc., which involved a wealthy food magnate within the show territory. That was basically all the information on it. Zeiss, it was interesting because at first he was trying to hide it, but then he was like, okay, fine, here's what's going on. He shared it with the group, and the group decided, okay, fine. We've done what we can here. Javin appears to be stabilized. Rory's dealing with his thing. Firnasil's back, so we can deal with the Thog issue, maybe. Let's head back to Holberg. Let's see what this plan is. So they go back, and they go back to Holberg, and the plan in detail was outlined, which I'm now going to outline for you briefly. It's not actually as relevant now for reasons that'll become apparent, but the idea was there was a show magnate in the city of Kinsho, down in the show territories, in the Hebian Toe province. And I was going to say, I don't think I wrote down any other notes as far as names and whatnot, which is unfortunate. Regardless, he has an unusual position because he has tons upon tons of food and general foodstuffs. And I'm not just talking about for people, I'm talking about for livestock and whatnot as well as for processing or brewing. You get the idea. Huge amounts of it, which, if you've been paying attention, is something that is a very valuable commodity in Alluvia right now, thanks to the need to feed a suddenly grown army. So they quickly realize, oh, this is a great opportunity to go, get hold of this stuff. So they go ahead and concoct this plan to... They come up with two ideas, basically. Sereth and Bonebreaker have come up with two different ideas. One is to go to this guy and basically engage in show politics, because show politics are kind of weird. In other words, he doesn't want you... the show magnate in question, I don't remember his name, it was a Burun. He would be indebted to the party if they were to steal a rare and valuable family artifact from one of his rivals. Now, the thing is, the way this works in show politics is he would then take this artifact to his rival and say, I'm sorry, you've lost this, let me return it to you. Because that would then not only put his rival in debt to him, but it would also mean the rival has lost face publicly, which means he has lost influence and political power publicly, because that's how political power works in the show. It's based off of your appearance, and I don't mean visual appearance, I mean your appearance of strength, your appearance of what you can do and how capable you are. So he would gain political power because he is seen to have accomplished this act, and recovering it for him, his rival would lose it for having lost it, etc. The other alternative, of course, is to go and just plain rob this guy. To go ahead and steal one of his, reliquary keys, which is access to a massive reliquary, which is just basically a trove of where he keeps the majority of his food stock, because he needs to keep it somewhere where it's going to be in stasis, especially given how much of it he has and how inability he has to move it right now. By the way, in case you're wondering why it is that Alluvia is not just doing business with these people directly, you're probably forgetting the fact that Alluvia and the show are not exactly on friendly terms, and they're not actually at war because it's politically confusing, but that's basically what the situation is. So an underground smuggling operation, like what the exchange is trying to do, would probably work for this. So they outlined that plan. Now, Guido... Guido rolled, I swear to God, like 5 1s on his awareness rolls, one after another, as these assassins are trying to hit him with these poison darts. Now the thing is, he kept rolling, he would roll a 1 on his awareness, and then he would roll a 15 on his fortitude. So these darts are doing nothing. And some of them are just sticking in his armor, because I couldn't beat his AC, because his AC is through the roof. I would literally have to roll a 20 to beat his AC. So he's just standing there, not interested in the political discussion. He's outside, as they're discussing these plans I just outlined to you. And he's just like, as these darts are coming, God, I don't even know how long later, he finally rolls greater than a 3 on his awareness check and realizes he's under attack. He's like, huh? Oh my God. And then he sees like 7 darts just sticking out of his armor. He's like, oh my God, okay. And so he starts to attack. The group goes after the assassins. Bonebreaker, this is actually when they find out Bonebreaker's class. I'm not going to share it with you, but let's just say that it's mean. It's an advanced class for a barbarian. That's all I'm going to say about that. He goes after them. He literally brutally destroys these assassins. Literally kills one of them with the body of the other as a improvised weapon, and basically narrowly avoids killing the last one. Higaide forces him to calm Bonebreaker down, because Bonebreaker literally had to make a save in order to pull out of his rage. So, realizing the danger of what was happening and the fact that they were being attacked within the hidden veil, because that's where this is happening, they realize, okay, this is a dangerous situation, we need to split up. Bonebreaker, Higaide, and Z decided to stay behind in the veil. Rory, Javin, Zeiss, and Guido headed towards Rory's mother's place at the docks. If you're wondering why, ignoring the fact that Rory has family living here, it's also the fact that Rory's mother has been brought up specifically twice before and has been threatened at least once before, so they were a little concerned about that. Coulson and Snarg headed toward Tia's place, that's Coulson's sister, to get Irondell, which is Coulson's niece, to safety. Now, we're going to go to the docks first, because that's how I did it during the session. While they were there, they found a particular elf that Zeiss believed was one of their assassins, which Rory decapitated in a rage. Rory and Guido then both went full tilt towards Rory's family. Zeiss, realizing that his own family might be in danger with regards to Sereth and whatnot, and so he decided to go ahead and flee back towards the Veil. That left Javin completely alone to deal with the guards. Poor Javin, a dragoon, I remind you, a dragoon fighter. However, Javin rolled really well, and he managed to convince the guards that there was this crazed Lugian on the loose, and he went that way. Meanwhile, Coulson and Snarg arrived at Tia's house to find what I quote here as a racist nanny. Basically, she didn't think very kindly of gnolls. And within very short order, Snorg rolled well enough to realize the house was being watched. So they decided to leave. 3 feet out of the door, I did a dice roll. And I want to stress this, because I was willing to let this hit any of the 4 targets that were available. There was the nanny, there was the niece, there was Snarg, and there was Coulson. Of those, 3 of those I would be okay with. 1 of those would really bother me, but I left it up to the dice. As it happened, it did not hit the innocent niece. It did hit the nanny, and unfortunately, I had already decided if it hit the nanny or the niece, they would be instantly dead from the poison. In the case of the seasoned level 7 adventurers, Snarg and Coulson would both get fortitude saves and then just take damage, but level 1 commoners, no, they're dead. So the nanny was dead, with a dart sticking out of her neck. Coulson and Snarg rushed right back in, with the niece being protected literally physically by their bodies, and they came up with a plan to distract their pursuers. They broke a window and set fire to the area, calling for help from the neighbors, who quickly helped out with the fire and then rushed to grab, some help. A few minutes later, they returned with some officials who were there to help. But Coulson rolled way better than I was expecting, and realized these people were lying, that they were not actually the officials. So they played along completely like, yes, okay, come on, let's help, here's the fire. And so they let the officials into the house, grabbed Irondell, rushed out the door, slammed it behind them, and then ran down the street. And the officials, who were of course in league with the assassins, or actually were the assassins because they weren't actually officials, immediately started giving them chase. As they started running down the street, they see several of the nearby taxis. I've actually described these in brief before, only to establish them so the party members would know that taxis are a thing in major cities, especially in Holberg, given the size of this place. So they see the taxis, and there's like 3 of them, and they look, and I described the taxis very deliberately. And after a moment of pause, the players are like, oh god, it's a trap. Because most of it, and in fact, several of the taxis that were present were in fact also traps. They were also further part of the assassination attempt. So they accurately and adequately chose the one taxi that was not part of the trap, leapt in, and were just like, go! Go! I wish I'd written down her name. It was an elven woman. I had fun role playing her. She was just this completely blasé, like, yeah, whatever. We want to go this place in a hurry. Okay, how much of a hurry? Gold. Okay, and she's just completely casual this whole time. I mean, there's no urgency to her appearance or her tone, but she's driving like an insane person as she's zooming through the streets, getting back to the Hidden Vale, trying to be safe. um, Oh, by the way, they actually had several of their neighbors with them. That's kind of important because they didn't want to leave the neighbors behind with the assassins, the fake officials who are also assassins, and the fake taxi officials, or excuse me, the fake taxi drivers who are also assassins. Dropping the neighbors and Iridona off at the Hidden Vale, the entire group headed off toward Rory's. Now, I actually did something very deliberate with this session. I actually went out of my way not to roleplay in character, not to on-camera roleplay what was happening with Rory. It's a dangerous decision whenever you do that with an actual player character, because a lot of player characters, a lot of people don't like it when you basically roleplay their character off camera, even if you're doing it for a good purpose, or even if you're doing it for the sake of the scene. But it's something so you'll notice this is only like the second time I've done this ever. It's something I don't like to do very often. But I felt this was a really good decision, a really good time to do it. So this whole time I've been role-playing with Coulson and Snarg with regards to this whole thing. When I got to the Rory situation, and Rory's like, okay, what have I been doing? And I'm like, hang on. And so I described what Rory had been doing, and it turns out that Rory had been fighting with these assassins for some time, who had given up all pretense of subtlety, and were literally just physically attacking them. In fact, when they arrived, Rory had just finished slicing into one of their shoulders with his axe and just, get the hell away from my mother. That kind of a situation. So the rest of the party members, at this point, which is basically everyone, because Z and, I think Z is the only one, but Z had come with. Everyone had come with. And they destroy the attackers at this point because, they completely overpower them and overwhelm them. And they're like, okay. Now they take a few prisoners. Having done so, having saved Iridona, having saved Rory's mother, they take Rory's mother with them. They get back in the taxi. The woman's still there, just totally casual, as they're brutally killing these people off like 20 feet from the taxi. Like, whatever. More gold. Yep, thanks. As they head back towards the Hidden Vale, and they find the people who are there, the members of the exchange who are there, very tense. And Iridona is just kind of playing in the corner. By the way, the niece, Iridona, Coulson's niece, is very young. I don't remember the exact age, but I believe it's about 5-ish, maybe 6. She's just playing in the corner, and she says, Uncle Coulson, I have a letter for you. And he's just like, what? And it turns out that shortly after they had left, a group had shown up at the Vale, forced their way in, a few casualties as a result, but a few injuries, but no casualties. And an individual who I described as a fully cloaked creature which seemed to have no legs hovered its way over to her and handed her with a gloved hand the following message. And it was just written in common on a piece of parchment, and it just said, it was written in Elvish, excuse me, but regardless, and it just said, "We could have killed her." And that's all. Now, that's actually the real second hammer, by the way. Or maybe it's the first. But regardless, Coulson did not take kindly to that. Most of the party did not take kindly to that. Being hit in their home base so easily and so effortlessly, or at least so it seemed, really got to the party. So they're like, okay, we need to deal with this, and we need to deal with this now. Now, a lot of the party basically lost all interest in the plan to go, rob this show magnate guy, right? Who is in Kinsho. I'm going to remind you of that because as soon as they start looking at at their prisoners, they had 3 of them. They quickly realized, thanks to Javin, they were desolate. Now, the party discussed, out of character for some time, how to deal with this, because they wanted information from these people, but they didn't know how to get it. So they finally decided Coulson was going to go ahead and weave a rune, which was going to put on them Well, Zeiss was actually going to put it on them to hide it on them, and the rune was going to make it so they could try to track them. Now, it had a limitation on range and had a limitation on detail, but at least they'd have some idea of where they went if they tried to translate away. Then they moved them into what was obviously a prison-looking area, and then they woke them. When they woke, per the plan, they immediately translated without even saying or hesitating. The rune informed them that they had head somewhere south, and they spent some time trying to analyze the information coming from it because it was very vague, but it turns out that they had ended up somewhere within the Hebian Toe province of the Sho Empire. Meanwhile, this is going to be kind of relevant maybe, depending on what happens in the future. Meanwhile, Ricard, who actually has been absent for this entire time. I'm sorry, I really should have mentioned that. Ricard actually left as soon as they hit Holberg. This is the first time he's come back, right after the assassination attempts. Make of that what you will. Ricard came back, and he informs the party that he was actually being punished for his active assistance in the party in his own words, non-Gerlin-related issues, and he was henceforth forbidden from doing so. However, he would be available for information, contacts, and otherwise, and of course he would be a retainer to Firnasil for the immediate future. Now, in that vein, he had informed the group that he had finally gotten his message out to his contacts regarding something the group had actually asked about several sessions ago, the soul augmentation experiments, which the show had apparently been working on. They were apparently centered in a area near the Hebian Toe region. You're probably sensing a trend here. Finally, they learned that the exchange... wait, what? Well, the exchange had already had agents within the city of Kinsho for this whole issue, and it was also the only agents the exchange had in all of the Sho territories. So one way or another, if they wanted to learn anything within the Sho territories, they were going to have to go to Kinsho. So they went ahead and got on board a magicite trawler. Now, this ship had already been prepared to ship food in the preparation of this whole heist mission that was about to happen. So they got on the ship and started heading south towards Kinsho, towards the Sho lands, which will make the first time the party's ever actually headed to the Sho territories. Now, I'm hesitant to reveal anything more, because the session went on for a brief additional period of time after this. But much of what happened was, well, obviously it was fully character growth, character developed, character related. One of the additional things that was revealed was that Guido, thanks to the stress of the recent times, was now a desolate. Again, that's something that I had been planning well in advance and had basically been meaning to happen right about now. It could have waited a little bit, it could have happened a bit before, but right after the assassination attempt was basically when I felt that was the best time to happen. Now, granted, the assassination attempt hadn't actually been planned for some time. I don't want to reveal too much about how I do things behind the scenes, but suffice it to say that certain party members had provoked certain NPCs in such a way that the assassination attempt was inevitable. So it only came down to when I, the GM, felt it would be best for the story for that assassination attempt to happen, because I can slot it in basically wherever and still have a reason for it to make sense at that point in time. And when the party came back after this thing, right about in preparation for the heist, felt like the best time to do that. Similarly, the party actually almost came to blows, again, on the magicite trawler. I don't even remember what by at this point. It's been a while. But in addition to that, well, I do remember that Snarg and Zeiss had, or was it, no, it was Snarg and Zeiss and Z and Zeiss basically had one ongoing argument of everyone versus Zeiss, basically. And that didn't turn out too well. I don't want to say too much about that. And the session basically ended with them still on the ship, heading towards Kinsho. And that basically brings us up to the now, aka when the campaign has officially ended. I know that's a hell of a way to end a campaign. However, as I said, I might have a way to continue it. No promises. Obviously, it will not be happening tomorrow. But if it does, you guys will probably be the first to hear about it. And I would like to hear back from you guys if you're interested in it, if you want it to continue, if you want the story to continue. Please feel free to let me know. If you hate me as a GM, you think my stories are terrible, let me know. You know, I'm listening, I swear. But regardless, we're going to go ahead and cut this off here, and I will see you on the next adventure.